My question for Han, or Honorable, he's saying, Dr. Price. Were the Hebrews in Egypt some 3,400 years ago? Thank you. Joseph Shellam.
Well, the Exodus must have been a myth. You could start there because there is, the way it's described, that there were these zillions of people, not only Israelites, but a mixed multitude who went with them. And it gives huge numbers as well. It and says how many cows and stuff they had. There is no sign of this. Well, for one thing, the armed host was so huge. Based on what we know about the extent of the Egyptian armies, they could have kicked the Egyptians' butts easily. So it's been blown up any way you look at it. But the thing that really kills it is that there is no detritus, no archaeological remains of such a journey, no matter which possible route you examine. And how would they examine it? Well, when they were trying to find Irem, the city of pillars mentioned in the Quran in the Saudi Arabian desert, they used infrared detection somehow to find ancient caravan routes, and they did find them. Well, if there had been this mass movement of zillions of people, there would be some kind of record left in the Sinai Peninsula even today. And there are like three, I think, hypothetical routes they could have taken, according to which hints in the Bible, but none of them show anything. And that's just impossible. There's also no physical evidence, no potsherds and so on. Well, it's hard enough to figure out how they could have gotten herds of cattle across what the text describes as a howling wilderness. So what they feed them with? Manna? But even if they didn't have the cows, you have that many people and a super caravan, and there's nobody threw anything away. I mean, it's just impossible. Did God send angels down with vacuum cleaners like the sanitation workers in New York sweeping up from a ticker tape parade? No, of course not. I mean, then you're getting into crazy stuff like, well, how come there are no dinosaurs in the Bible, but there's evidence of them? Oh, in that case, Satan sent a bunch of guys to plant false information. Come on, get out of here. So it's impossible. But it seems much more likely to me that, as Giovanni Garbini says in his terrific book, History and Ideology in Ancient Israel, that the Israel and Egypt stories were circulated to give a false Egyptian pedigree to the Jews who lived in Ptolemaic Egypt after Alexander the Great, when General Ptolemy became the emperor of that piece of Alexander's empire. And Jews, that's where Alexandria was, and Jews got along real well there. So they were like saying, well, you know, we're not really foreigners. We've been here hundreds of years and all that. And I find that to explain an awful lot. And in the same way, why did Abraham hail from Ur of the Chaldees, from Babylonia? It has no real function in the story. You could say, well, it's there because that's the way it happened. But I find it more reasonable to say that since Jews also got along real well in Babylon for hundreds of years, that similarly this was a way of saying, you know, we're not really aliens. Our patriarch was from here, so we're really Babylonians too. And this kind of fits in with the general tendency of the ancient Middle Eastern empires, who did move populations around, to say to the newly moved people, you know, we're doing you a favor here. You know, your ancestors are from here. We're bringing you home. So don't look back to that piece of land in Palestine. So, I mean, this we do know about. We know that that the empires did this sort of thing. But, or back to the Egyptians, and Israel and Egypt. As Hermann Gunkel pointed out in his book, The Legends of Genesis, he said, people that want to think that the stories of Genesis, for instance, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, all that stuff, were true, and that we even know what people said, like when Hagar's henpecking Abraham, get that lady out of here with her son, she's giving me trouble. Gunkel said, now wait a minute, let me get this straight. Subsequent to that, Jews were in Egypt for 450 years, and we hear nothing about what happened in that time. But before that, we actually have the script of a sitcom here. We know that this one said that. Come on. So on the one hand, forget about the patriarchal narratives as fact, but on the other, there is no Exodus Israel and Egypt narrative. And there's just nothing. It's like the apostles again. What do we know about these guys? Just a list of names. So there again, it's conceivable, but you have an awful lot of explaining to do, and it's hard to believe you would if such a thing had happened.
Is it a good idea? Will it sell? To write a book concerning the journey from Christian eschatology to astrotheology mythology. Kevin Maxwell.
Well, there is an overlap because apocalyptic works in Judaism, the Secrets of Enoch, the Book of Enoch, and various other ones, they come from the scribes and the intellectuals and even the natural philosophers of Judaism. And so often in apocalypses, or that is in several of the apocalypses, the heavenly secrets are: what are the stars? Where are the snowflakes stored? Where is the rain stored? Enoch has shown all of this by angels, and here's where the stars are, and so forth. And in other apocalypses, they major on the secrets of the future. Well, in the first case, you have pre-technological astronomers like you had in Babylon and China, and so these were their theories about what it must be like up there. But of course, how would you know? Well, they said it was revealed to Enoch all long ago, which really fits into the fact that Enoch must have been a sun god originally. And at the future, well, they figured, who knows about that? Well, the ancient kings of Israel and Judah did, because when they were crowned again every year, just like the king of Babylon, they would be taken into the temple and ascend to heaven, at least they said so, and were given a look at the tablets of destiny so they would know what would happen in the next year. And so you better trust what they say. They've seen the future, you haven't. And so these were two specialties of the scribes who wrote this stuff, including collections of proverbs and stuff, the wisdom literature. And so there is an overlap between astrotheology and apocalypticism. You don't really need either for the other, but the same group was churning both of them out. And especially since they finally come together at the end, where there's a new heaven, a new earth, and the stars fall from heaven, and all of that. So they're trying to explain the way the world is put together now. That's what the priestly creation account of Genesis is. It's not myth. It's early natural science. It's very much like Thales and Anaximander and Empedocles and all those guys who were trying to figure out, how did we get to this world of diversity from a single original substance, which might have been water, Thales said, and so does the priestly writer. And gradually they separated. I mean, it's so, as Wellhausen pointed out long ago, this isn't poetry. This isn't even mythology. It's early science, scientific speculation before the invention of the telescope or anything like that. So the two fit together, and you could entertain both. In fact, if you're like again, my late friend Acharya, with the astrotheology, you almost have to put them together, because Enoch, the character who explains both the primordial times, the sons of God and all that stuff, and what's going to happen when the one like a son of man comes, very much like Daniel, he is, and he's telling you how the heavens are laid out. Originally, he simply was the sun. Just like Hercules was, Samson, Elijah, Moses, they were simply the sun, Esau. And I can go into that, but probably boring everybody to a coma already. So they coexist and interact. So I guess if you're going from one to the other, what that would really mean is you find the verifiable part that has been debunked, that is the actual description of heaven as they believed. You find that no longer believable because of modern science, but modern science can't tell you the future, so you can still, by faith, believe that it's going to wind up as it says in the Bible.
And I guess just to add to his question, I think he's trying to imply is, do you think it's worth writing a book coming from Christian eschatology, where he's from, to an astrotheology mythology book? Do you think it's worth it? Do you think it would sell?
I would think so, because it would give you the opportunity to do at greater length what I just tried to do, to explain where biblical astronomy, astrology came from, and where eschatology came from, what they have to do with each other, and are they depend upon one another. I mean, I'll never have time to write it, but I think it would be really interesting to read. Good thinking.
What's the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
I
Emmett
used to
Sutton.
know. Yeah, I used to know, what was it? This kind of swallow or that one? The guy tries to answer it, and turns out there's two different kinds.
I don't even know.
Yeah, it's from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I remember, even as a fundamentalist, I saw that when it came out in the theater, and it was the funniest thing I had ever seen. Of course, I love The Life of Brian. That is so well researched and so forth. In fact, in my new book, Holy Fable 4, in the section of the book dealing with the Book of Mormon, I quote something from a scene in The Life of Brian that is almost identical to this scene where Samuel the Lamanite, a prophet, is predicting the future. It's just as creaky and silly. You'd think the one came from the other.
My question for Dr. Price: is it possible that Simon Magus was preaching through theater like Euripides? Santo Vlasis.
I know of nothing that suggests it, but it's certainly possible. He would have had a heck of a story to tell. Of course, he couldn't really depict, well, I guess he could, the what's the word, the beginning of it, how the fall of the Ennoia, the primal thought, like Sophia, and her degradation in the material world, her incarnation as Helen of Troy and so forth, and then his own role liberating the current incarnation of Helen as a prostitute in a brothel. I've always thought of what he said, how he recruited her and he'd rescued her and she went around with him. I always thought how similar that is to a scene in Taxi Driver when Travis Bickle rescues Jodie Foster, I forget who it was, there's a kid from this brothel, and it's very much like that. So I guess you could have a few scenes like that, and of course he wouldn't have had the scene of him flying through the air, though that could have been arranged with a scaffold and all that, because that's part of an anti-Simonian thing where Peter beats him at miracles and so forth. But I don't know of any anybody that has suggested that, which doesn't mean anything. I mean, I'm always interested in new possibilities, but I don't see anything that really suggests it. As far as we know, he did a kind of magic show. You can believe in me because who else can do this, and so on. That's a kind of theater, especially if he contrived it. But I don't know. That's really interesting. I'd like to hear more about the possibility.
Paul's man of sin, 2 Thessalonians 2, is it a zealot leader or Roman ruler? And where does he, or the actual writer, get the idea? Does it predate the rebellion, 66 to 73 AD? And therefore, is it from Daniel 7:8 or Daniel 9:27, reflecting Matthew 24:15 through 16? Or from another biblical concept, or even pagan mythology? Or is it written after the rebellion? If so, how do we know, and why is it written as a coming event? Richard Young.
Well, it does have pre-biblical origins in the Zoroastrian or Persian character Asdahak, and who is pictured as a giant, I guess, with 3 heads, 3 dragon heads, I think. And that survives into Revelation, where you have the Antichrist or the beast depicted as Leviathan from other Old Testament passages. And the thing is that it appears that Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the villain intended in Daniel, was understood in line with that. At least it's the same sort of a thing. And it comes from Judaism, once Judaism had been transformed into a kind of Jewish Zoroastrianism after the exile. Well, once it turned out that Antiochus was defeated, and the horrible, he did defile the temple, but they reconsecrated it and so forth. But the end didn't come. The same people perceived the attempt later of Caligula, threatening to set up a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple, which sparked an agricultural strike and so forth, which would have really hurt Rome, because they relied on the bread basket there, and luckily Caligula died before it could come to that. That became part of it, and he enters into the temple of God, saying that he is God and so forth. And so this continued, and it seems like Thessalonians embodies this now traditional growing myth of the Antichrist. And the man of sin, he also calls him the man of the lie. That apparently is what Belial means, or sometimes Beliar, you see it written, the man of the lie. What fellowship hath Christ with Belial? And Christ and Antichrist, so that you can throw Judas in here too, the man of sin, which may be intended to have the resonance of he is the Antichrist, the opponent of Christ. I don't know, but I think that it is not by Paul, but it almost doesn't matter, because whoever wrote this is apparently trying to gin up eschatological fervor anyway. I mean, you might say, well, come on, if Jerusalem has already fallen and so on, why say that? Well, look at books published by the score today, when they're still quoting bits of the Bible and saying, oh, this is it, it's Saddam Hussein, it's this one, it's that one. It's just too beguiling. And of course, as stupid as that sounds, it isn't really. It's truer than they know, because like currently in the wake of the coronavirus, you have this lockdown of different places and this surveillance state stuff. We're going to lock you up if somebody rats on you and says you're outside when you shouldn't be. And worse yet, the idea of having a chip or some kind of identifier that you've been vaccinated or you can't get a driver's license, etc. A fundamentalist might say, oh, that's it, that's the mark of the beast. In fact, I saw on the news somebody in Texas, a couple of people carrying this huge banner that said, Texas will not take the mark of the beast. Well, you can look at them and say, oh, it's just Dale Gribble, they're nuts. No. I mean, they may think it is a literal one-for-one fulfillment, but they're right. The problem is they don't see that these great biblical symbols are describing recurring scenarios throughout history, so that when you see something like this, this stunt about to be pulled, you can say, you know, that reminds me of the mark of the beast. And you're right. That's the idea. You're supposed to be galvanized, say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Not that we're near the end of the world, but this looks suspicious. Was Hitler the Antichrist? Well, the world didn't end, but of course he was. As 1 John says, there's many Antichrists. And it's very profound. The fundamentalists are jumping the gun in one sense, but they're entirely right in another.
Interesting. Has Dr. Bob read any of these recent books, and if so, what does he think? A History of the Bible by John Barton, Christianity, The First 3,000 Years by Diarmaid MacCulloch, I believe, and or A History of Judaism by Martin Goodman.
I've not read any of them. I'm not even familiar with them, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. According to Wiki, synagogues existed well before the 2nd century AD, and I don't see how their being mentioned in the New Testament somehow negates it being written in the 1st century. Michael Lito.
Well, yeah, we know that they were around in New Testament times. It's debated, I think, whether synagogues were already existing during the Babylonian exile, though they might have been. But it looks like that they probably existed in the diaspora, since there was no way everybody could go to the temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year. But the issue is there any archaeological evidence in Palestine or in Galilee of synagogues during the first third of the 1st century when Jesus would have lived? And it seems like the only 1 or 2 that may have existed were in the Hellenized areas, because Herod the Great had settled a bunch of Greeks and diaspora Jews in places like Caesarea Philippi, and which was basically Hellenistic, though some Jews lived there. And so far, there's been no convincing evidence even of a populated Nazareth in that period. On and off, Nazareth had been inhabited for hundreds and hundreds of years, but sometimes it wasn't. And there's no compelling evidence to show that anybody even lived there in the time Jesus supposedly lived there, though they did rebuild it in about 20 years later, which was before the Gospels were written, so that by the time they were written, the authors assumed that Nazareth as they knew it had existed in Jesus' day, and that they had forgotten that Jesus the Nazarene was a sect label, like saying Jesus the Presbyterian or something. And so we can't disprove it. It's an argument from silence. But it does seem a little odd. It does raise the question as to whether there was a Nazareth, or if there would have been a synagogue there.
Is he on the West Coast? He should carry a bronze pole with an image of a coronavirus on it to heal him if he gets ill out there. Rocha Asura.
Oh, I love that guy. He writes to the Bible Geek, and he writes for the Journal of Higher Criticism. This man is a convert to Hinduism who is amazingly well read. He writes critical articles on the Ramayana, the Bhagavad Gita, the New Testament. He's just incredible. He's another Frank Zindler, and he's also got a great sense of humor. And
I can see.
He's terrific.
Can you ask Dr. Bob if he can put more of his books on Audible I'm sorry I butcher your name. I think it's Ovidiu Christia.
Well, my book, Jesus Christ Superstition, is about to be recorded, though not by me. I don't know the name of the outfit that bought the rights to it. The publisher of the book dealt with them. I would like to read another one or two, but I have so little time with my writing and podcasting that it's very difficult to imagine getting to it. Especially, like, I don't think I'd live long enough to read Holy Fable 4, which is something like 670 pages. But I would like to record them myself, but I have to admit, if anybody approached me, as they just did with the one, that I'd say, yeah, let's get it on tape with somebody else reading it. Oh yeah, there is a problem though. As I understand it, Prometheus books will not allow audio books, whether I recorded them or anybody else did. I don't know why.
In the City of God, 16.9, St. Augustine said, "As to the fable that there are antipodes, that is to say, men on the opposite side of the earth, where the sun rises when it sets on us, men who walk with their feet opposite ours, there is no reason for believing it. Those who affirm it do not claim to oppose any actual information. They merely conjecture that, since the earth is suspended within the concavity of the heavens, and there is as much room on one side of it as on the other, therefore the part which is beneath cannot be void of human inhabitants. They fail to notice that even should it be believed or demonstrated that the world is round or spherical in form, it does not follow that the part of the earth opposite to us is not completely covered with water, or that any conjectured dry land there should be inhabited by men. For Scripture, which confirms the truth of its historical statements by the accomplishments of its prophecies, teaches not falsehood, and it is too absurd to say that some men might have set sail from this side, and traversing the immense expanse of ocean, have propagated there a race of human beings descended from that one first man. Turns out he was wrong. As I sit here in the Antipodes laughing, I'd love to know a few of Dr. Price's favorite blunders from the Church Fathers." And this is from John Stevens.
I know there is an often quoted statement, supposedly from Agustin, about the supposed inhabitants of the Antipodes, that they have faces in the middle of their abdomen, sort of like Arnim Zola and Captain America. But this seems to be, I gather it's not this, but I kept waiting for that description, and nobody can find that quote. It looks like a spurious attempt to just make the Church Fathers look bad. But Augustine, well, I don't get the impression you're trying to say what an idiot he was. It's just that he's caught believing things that we now know better about. That it wasn't absurd to think that the earth is flat. I mean, it's obvious that it is, though it's not true. It sure looks like that. And to the untrained eye and without telescopes and all that stuff. But he's certainly saying that the Bible confirms this. Well, that's, again, even that's not, like, what would be absurd is, like the flat earthers today, we know too much now to make this a viable theory as it used to be. So if you're saying the earth is flat today, it's probably because the Bible does seem to say it, because that's what they thought then. Now, this is like what Paul Tillich called naive literalism versus reactive literalism. The fact that he says the fact that the Bible says it means it's true, that raises the whole question of the inspiration and authority of the Bible. And there are many people who are evangelical Christians who will say, no, the Bible is not textbook of science. And that's like the thing where, oh, Jesus says the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds on earth. Well, it isn't. The orchid seed is smaller. Oh, no, I guess Jesus says there's a lot of baloney. Nah, as my favorite theologian, Bugs Bunny, says, you made a wrong turn in Albuquerque. Like, this is a reductio ad absurdum of that view, that there are no misstatements of any kind. The problem is does that vitiate the whole thing? It's hard to believe it does. I mean, are you going to take the Sermon on the Mount's ethics less seriously because of the stupid mustard seed? That's utterly absurd. So the question is, well, how do I balance that out? Where do I stop? Joshua, the sun stands still, well, that couldn't really be, but that becomes absurd in the same way. But and some people are willing to say, yeah, all right, it's not the terms in which it says a thing. Like a parable is obviously not supposed to be factual, but it's making a particular point. And maybe that's what's going on in all of these things. Jesus isn't teaching botany, he's talking about faith and so forth. Well, where do we stop with that? Because Rudolf Bultmann, with his demythologizing program, said, well, things like the resurrection of Jesus, that didn't happen either. But it's the part of the preaching of rebirth into an authentic existence that only faith in Christ can bring. Is that okay to do? I did a whole book on this called Inerrant the Wind. Little pun there. It's very difficult to redo the thing, to reboot any idea of biblical authority when the bottom line is you can't say something is true simply because it's in the Bible anymore. But it's a funny thing here. Why could Agustin say such a thing? Well, he figured this is the truth. I mean, he believed that just as one of the ancients about the flat earth and all that. And he believed the Bible tells us the truth and the two fit. And they did at that time. Everybody thought it was flat. And the Bible writers thought it was flat too. But what happens when you find that it's not so? Well, the temptation is what I call the biblical hermeneutical ventriloquism, where you can't admit the Bible was wrong, because then you're going to have to do the retooling and nobody knows how to do it yet. So you say, oh, well, we've just been reading the Bible wrong. We thought it said the earth was flat, but if you look at this verse and translate it this way, it's really saying it's a round ball. You see, the Bible knew it before we did. Well, then why didn't we know it? I mean, we've been reading the Bible for a long time, and so the Bible becomes a ventriloquist dummy, and you're playing catch-up with the Bible. Like, would you go so far as to say the ancients didn't understand that there was a legitimate homosexual orientation? We do. They couldn't have known it. So is the Bible wrong when it condemns that, and we allow that? It's a museum relic in that sense. We'll have to do our own reasoning about it. Is that okay? Like we had to do our own astronomy. I don't mean to embarrass anybody. They're real problems. But I can't laugh them off. I can't think of other patristic goofs offhand, but in the Bible you do have the Joshua and the sun standing still, and the absurd attempts to say, well, maybe what God did was to change the refractive index so it seemed like the sun was in the sky longer than it was. Do you really think that's what's involved? I mean, that's like a Star Wars behind the scenes. Here's all the technical legerdemain that led to this. Do you really think that's what happened? Or Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes? Well, actually he didn't, but he just made the gesture of giving the can of tuna and the crackers to the crowd, knowing that it would prompt them to say, if he's willing to share, maybe I should too. And so you had your lunch squirreled away and said, okay, here, anybody need any salmon or whatever? And so that's very clever, but do you really think that, I mean, they're not going to tell you the main point of the story if that's the point of the story, and so on. When you start doing that, these ad hoc hypotheses, you're just making the Bible becomes a ventriloquist dummy again. You can make it say anything you want if you say, all right, I'm up against the wall. What it seems to say is just not true. And then you start winging it. Oh, maybe it means this, maybe it means that. Well, Martin Luther was trying to put an end to that when he said the Bible says one thing. We were not always sure what it is, but you have no business interpreting the Bible like it was a Ouija board or the I Ching or something like that. Read it like you would read Caesar's Gallic Wars or Seneca's epistles. There might be ambiguities, but you know how to read a human text written to humans, because if it's more than that, who's going to say what it really means? The Pope? You? Exodore, who's it going to be? And it can mean anything and everything, which means it means nothing.